This is still unanswered. I'm Elena Maris. Tonight, we go back to a week in late September and early October 1982, when a single household product, one most of us had on a shelf in our bathroom or kitchen, became a weapon. 7 people in the Chicago area died after taking cyanide-laced extra-strength Tylenol capsules. The city panicked. Stores pulled bottles off shelves, and one of the largest product recalls in American history began. But the most basic question, who did it, remains unanswered.
I'm Marcus Ellison. As a forensic toxicologist and someone who's worked on product tampering cases for decades, this one has always felt different. It wasn't a targeted killing. It weaponized a public's trust in an everyday medicine. The poison was potassium cyanide. In some capsules, the dose was almost 3 times what it would take to kill a person. That's the hard fact that keeps this case haunting.
Let's start with the week itself. I want to walk listeners through the chronology, slowly, deliberately, because the way these events unfolded matters to understanding how investigators eventually pieced things together. Marcus, do you remember the first death in that sequence?
Yeah. The first confirmed death was a 12-year-old girl, Mary Kellerman, from Elk Grove Village. She took extra-strength Tylenol on the morning of September 29, 1982, for a cold and collapsed very quickly. That same day, in Arlington Heights, a postal worker named Adam Janus took Tylenol and also died, though he survived long enough to be hospitalized before passing. That set off a domino of tragic events.
Right, and so the Janus family, that's one of the most painful parts. Adam's brother Stanley and Stanley's wife Theresa also took pills from the same bottle in the Janus bathroom and collapsed. 3 family members, dead or dying, in one household from one bottle. It's almost too cruel to describe.
It is. The Janus home is where a crucial piece of detective work happened. A public health nurse, Helen Jensen, went to the house to try to find an environmental cause. She checked cabinets, and she found an open bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. She counted the capsules and realized the number missing matched the number of people who'd taken them. She demanded the bottle be tested. That insistence likely prevented a lot more deaths.
It really did. When the capsule samples were analyzed by the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, Edmund Donoghue and Chief Toxicologist Michael Schaffer, they found potassium cyanide in 4 of the remaining 44 capsules. And as Marcus said earlier, some capsules contained doses nearly 3 times lethal. Investigators also reported a distinctive bitter almond smell when the bottle was opened.
Cyanide has that classic odor, though not everyone can smell it. The toxicology work was quick and decisive. Once cyanide was confirmed, authorities recognized this was not an isolated household tragedy, but a public health emergency.
Which is when the city basically stopped taking Tylenol. There are images that stick with me. Police and firefighters driving through neighborhoods over loudspeakers, telling people to throw away their Tylenol. Mayor Jane Byrne banning the sale of Tylenol inside Chicago, stores clearing shelves. And within 48 hours, grocery stores and drugstores had shipped bottles to labs for testing. The panic was palpable.
Yeah, and the product itself mattered. Extra-strength Tylenol was an extremely familiar over-the-counter pain reliever, acetaminophen in capsule form. At the time, Tylenol had roughly 35 to 40% of the U.S. pain reliever market. People trusted it the way many of us trusted Bayer aspirin in an earlier era. Capsules were preferred because they were easy to swallow, but that very convenience left them vulnerable. You could open the gelatin capsule, dump the powder, refill it with something else, and snap it back together with little visible damage.
So, right away, investigators had to ask, did this tampering happen at the factories or closer to home? Stores, distribution, the local level? What did the evidence point to, Marcus?
At first, investigators considered a single lot or plant. They identified a lot number, MC2880, that connected Mary Kellerman's bottle and the Janus bottle. But as more deaths were linked to cyanide-tainted Tylenol, lab results showed the contaminated bottles came from multiple lot numbers and from different factories. For example, Mary McFarland's bottle was from lot 1910 MD or MB2738, different than the Janus lot. That pattern suggests the tampering did not occur at a single manufacturing plant. Instead, it pointed to in-store or local distribution tampering. Someone buying or stealing bottles, opening capsules, adding cyanide, and returning them to store shelves.
Which is terrifying in its randomness. You didn't have to be anyone in particular. You just had to be at a store at the right time. Listeners, just imagine buying a bottle of pain relief that you always trusted and not knowing it could kill you. The randomness made it a different kind of crime.
Exactly. And once the link to Tylenol was public, it set off a wave of hoaxes and copycats across the country. But hold on, before we jump ahead, Elena, can I ask you about public reaction? From your reporting on these kinds of corporate crises, how unusual was the public surrender of a trusted product?
It was seismic. People literally dumped Tylenol in trash cans. Parents canceled trick-or-treating that year in some communities. Grocery sales for Halloween candies plummeted. Some reports said over 20% declines. And it forced a national conversation about product safety that hadn't existed in the same way before. For a brief period, the marketplace itself, shelves, packages, was part of the crime scene. That upended how big brands and regulators thought about packaging vulnerabilities.
And that feeds into the corporate response. Johnson & Johnson's McNeil division, Tylenol's manufacturer, took extraordinary steps. Within days, they halted production and advertising. Then, on October 5, 1982, they issued a nationwide recall of roughly 31 million bottles, with a retail value of over $100 million at the time. They told consumers not to take Tylenol and offered to replace capsules with tablets once tablets were confirmed safe.
That recall and the way J&J communicated afterward have since been studied in business schools as a kind of crisis management gold standard. They prioritized consumer safety over short-term profit, pulled product nationwide, and cooperated with law enforcement and the FDA. But, there's always that tension. They were also protecting a multi-billion-dollar brand. Marcus, do you think their actions were more altruistic or more self-interested?
I don't think it's one or the other. Companies are incentivized to protect their brand, their long-term survival. But in this case, the public safety measures they took were the right thing to do and also aligned with their interest in preserving consumer trust. The outcome, a shift in packaging and a recovery of market share within a year, shows that putting safety first can be both ethical and pragmatic.
So J&J's response, even if it was self-protective too, set a template. It also ushered in real legal and regulatory changes. Marcus, walk us through that, because the law that followed matters almost as much as the crimes themselves.
In 1983, Congress acted. The so-called Tylenol Bill, an amendment to Title 18 U.S. Code Section 1365, made it a federal offense to tamper with consumer products in interstate commerce, carrying heavy penalties, including potentially life imprisonment if death resulted. That statute gave federal investigators a tool to pursue product tamperers across state lines. And the FDA issued tamper-resistant packaging regulations on November 5, 1982, which required OTC drugs to have an indicator or barrier to entry, something consumers could see or check that would show if a package had been compromised.
Right. The FDA rules forced an industry-wide rethinking. Capsules, identified as the weak link because they're easy to open and refill, were replaced by solid tablets and the so-called caplet, plus multiple layers of tamper-evident packaging, foil seals, shrink bands, blister packs. The industry estimated the cost at the time as tens of millions of dollars, maybe 1 or 2 cents more per unit at retail. But the change was permanent.
And those packaging changes likely saved lives later. But the legal and regulatory aftermath didn't close the case. The investigation itself turned into one of the largest manhunts in Chicago's modern history. Local police, Illinois State Police, the Cook County Medical Examiner, the FBI, thousands of tips. Yet, no one was ever charged with the murders.
Which brings us to suspects and theories. We should walk listeners through the main leads investigators pursued, starting with James William Lewis. Marcus, can you summarize who Lewis was and why the FBI focused on him?
James William Lewis was a man with a history of fraud and other crimes living in New York City at the time. Shortly after the Tylenol deaths began, Johnson & Johnson received an extortion letter demanding $1 million to stop the murders. The letter claimed responsibility and included some case details. The FBI traced the letter to Lewis through handwriting and postal clues and charged him with extortion. He was convicted and served roughly a decade in federal prison. Law enforcement often called him a primary suspect, primarily because of the extortion letter. But no physical evidence linked him to the tampered bottles, and there were logistical questions. He lived in New York, not Chicago.
There are 2 competing ways to see Lewis. One says he wrote a letter taking credit, demanded a ransom. That's pretty incriminating. The other says opportunistic criminal, capitalizing on chaos, extortion, piggybacking on murders he didn't commit. The FBI leaned towards suspecting him in the killings, but with no physical evidence, they charged him only with extortion. He denied involvement in the murders until his death in 2023.
And that ambiguity has kept Lewis central in public narratives. He shows up in the recent Netflix docuseries and in decades of reporting. But it's important to stress, he was never tried or convicted for murder. The extortion conviction is real. The murder charge is not.
Then there's Roger Arnold, a local man who became a focus of suspicion and community rumor. Marcus, do you want to lay out Arnold's situation?
Roger Arnold was a 48-year-old dock worker who lived on the northwest side of Chicago. He had some interest in chemistry and certain hobby activities. A bar owner told police Arnold had been talking about cyanide and complaining about Johnson & Johnson. Police searched his home and found chemicals, including cyanide, and technical books. But the cyanide composition didn't match what was in the Tylenol capsules. The impurities and trace elements didn't line up. Arnold was never charged in the Tylenol murders, but he later shot and killed a man named John Stanisha in 1983 during a confrontation, and Arnold was convicted of second-degree murder in that incident. He exemplifies how suspicion and rumor can destroy a life even when the evidence doesn't fit.
There's something tragic and enraging about that. An entire community, a man's life, gets fractured by suspicion, amplified by media frenzy. It's a reminder that in these high-profile investigations, the pressure can break people who may be innocent. We should also talk about other theories. Inside jobs, lone wolves, copycats.
Investigators considered an insider in manufacturing or distribution, but the multiple lots and factories involved argued against a single plant. The leading inference was in-store tampering. Other theories proposed anyone from a disgruntled employee to a person aiming to cause mass panic, even a political actor. Then there are copycats. The Chicago crimes seem to inspire hoaxes and later lethal tamperings, like the Excedrin cyanide murders in 1986 involving Stella Nichol. Nichol actually poisoned Excedrin capsules to kill her husband for insurance money. She planted bottles in stores to make it look like random tampering, and later was convicted under the federal product tampering law and sentenced to 90 years.
Which complicates the narrative. Some product tampering was random mass terror, and some was a cover for targeted murder. The existence of later copycats shows that the method itself could be used both ways. But in Chicago, the victims, Mary Kellerman, Adam, Stanley, Theresa Janus, Mary Reiner, Mary McFarland, and Paula Prince, appear to have been randomly selected by their access to tampered bottles.
Yes, and those victims deserve to be at the center of the story. The Janus family, the 3 deaths in one household, are especially visible in records and documentaries. Survivors and relatives have sought answers for decades and participated in retrospectives, interviews, and, more recently, in the Netflix series.
Speaking of the Netflix documentary, there's been renewed attention in 2024 and 2025. The series brings James Lewis on camera in what were among his last interviews. It revisits leads, re-examines investigative choices, and, importantly, pushes for new tips. That publicity has sometimes spurred law enforcement to retest evidence with modern techniques, like touch DNA analysis on the Prince Walgreens bottle or on extortion materials. Marcus, from a forensic perspective, how much can modern science, DNA, trace analysis, add to a 40-plus-year-old case?
Modern forensics are a game changer in some cases, but they're not a guaranteed answer, especially with evidence collected decades ago. We now can extract tiny amounts of touch DNA from surfaces that, back in 1982, were treated and stored without the protocols we use today. That can help generate leads. But DNA is only useful if it matches a known profile or points to someone in a database. Packaging and capsule materials can also be analyzed with improved techniques to link sources. Still, contamination over time, storage conditions, and the absence of reference samples limit what we can reliably conclude. So new tests can narrow suspects or produce leads, but they rarely deliver immediate closure.
Right. And in this case, we've had a mix of renewed testing and headline-grabbing claims, like the deathbed confession story that surfaced in 2023 involving a man named Daniel Raymond Drozd. We need to be careful here. The claims are unverified. The story, as reported, comes from a son, Joseph Sibeli, who says his father confessed on his deathbed. Drozd was a former Lyons police officer and later worked in electroplating, potentially giving him access to cyanide. Sibeli alleges physical items and troubling behavior, but Chicago police have not endorsed Drozd as the killer, and as of the latest reporting, there were no charges based on those claims.
This is a common pattern in high-profile cold cases. Deathbed confessions and retrospective claims can be compelling emotionally, but from an evidentiary standpoint, they require corroboration, documents, physical evidence, matching DNA, witness testimony. Without that, such claims remain one more unresolved thread in a larger tapestry of leads and false starts.
And to be frank, sometimes family members grappling with traumatic histories can misremember or look for explanations that make sense of the senseless. That doesn't mean they lie intentionally, but memory is fallible and grief is complicated. I'm trying to be cautious because these stories affect real families.
Absolutely. We have to honor victims' families while also upholding standards of evidence. That balance is hard in public conversation, where narratives and the need for closure often outrun hard proof.
Let's zoom out and talk about what changed because of this case. Policy, packaging, public perceptions. These are concrete outcomes. Marcus, what did the Tylenol murders do to regulation and industry practices?
They transformed them. The FDA's tamper-resistant packaging regulations required visible indicators or barriers to entry. Industry moved from capsules to tablets and caplets, and companies adopted multiple tamper-evident seals. The federal product tampering statute gave prosecutors a tool that could reach across states, which was crucial because tampered products often cross state lines. In short, the case changed how manufacturers, regulators, and retailers thought about product integrity. And those changes likely prevented similar crimes and reduced the ease with which someone could tamper with products and go undetected.
But there's a darker cultural change, too. The murders cemented a kind of public paranoia around everyday items and revived the old urban legends about poisoned Halloween candy, even though documented cases of such candy tampering are virtually non-existent. The Tylenol case gave new life to those fears and altered parental behaviors in ways that lingered for years.
There's also a legal legacy. The Tylenol bill and later convictions, like Stella Nichols, show the law adapting to new criminal methods. Nichols' conviction in the Excedrin case, using the federal product tampering statute, demonstrated prosecutors could actually use those tools to obtain real convictions against perpetrators who used consumer products as murder weapons.
Let's bring it back to the human cost. The families, Janus, Kellerman, Reiner, McFarland, Prince, have lived with this absence. Some settled civil suits with Johnson & Johnson. J&J did not admit liability. For many of these families, nothing replaces knowing who killed their loved ones. And the Janus household, 3 deaths from one bottle, remains one of the most devastating images from the week.
I want to underscore that. In both my work and research, the victims and families are sometimes marginalized by the sensational overlays. Here, the victims were ordinary people with ordinary days. Kids with colds, a new mom with postpartum pain, a flight attendant on a layover. That ordinariness is what makes the crime so chilling.
We also need to talk about investigative failures and the role of media. The case involved so many agencies and so many tips that tunnel vision was a risk. Some journalists and documentaries have pointed to possible missteps, lines of inquiry that cooled off, suspects not pursued strongly enough. The Netflix series, for instance, questions simple answers and asks whether some leads were prematurely dismissed. Marcus, did you see evidence that technology might help find closure, or are we at the mercy of how evidence was collected back then?
Both. Technology like advanced DNA testing, improved mass spectrometry, and trace chemical analysis can sometimes squeeze new information from old evidence. For example, touch DNA on bottle caps, saliva on packaging, or unique impurities in cyanide samples could theoretically link a suspect. But the usefulness of those techniques depends on the chain of custody and how evidence was preserved. If items were handled repeatedly or stored in suboptimal conditions, contamination becomes a major issue. So modern forensics can help, but it's not magic.
Got it. Now, quick point that often confuses people. Many assume James Lewis was convicted of murder. He wasn't. He was convicted of extortion. He died in 2023. The official record? No one has ever been charged with these murders. The case is technically still open. Marcus, do investigators today still treat it as active? Are there periodic retests?
Yes. Investigators have periodically reopened files and ordered new forensic tests. As recently as the 2020s, authorities ordered new DNA testing on key pieces of evidence, like the Prince Walgreens bottle and the extortion materials. But those tests have not, publicly at least, produced a chargeable lead. Law enforcement statements typically say the case remains open and that they welcome tips.
So, we end where we started, unresolved. But before we close, I want to ask you, Marcus, what's the single biggest takeaway from a forensic view? What lesson should investigators and manufacturers keep in mind when they look at a case like this?
Don't assume anything is too mundane to be a crime scene. In 1982, packages, bottles, and retail shelves weren't treated like potential crime scenes. Now they are. Preserve evidence, document chain of custody, and apply cross-disciplinary thinking, product distribution, packaging design, toxicology. The Tylenol case taught us that weapons of mass harm can be ordinary things. That insight changed how evidence is collected and how packaging is regulated.
And from a social perspective, maybe my takeaway is this. The case asks us to weigh what we value, convenience versus safety. The capsule was convenient. It likely reduced choking risks and made ingestion easier for many people. But that convenience also introduced vulnerability. Society chose to accept a small cost to protect safety. Better seals, caplets, tamper bans, but those changes came after people died. That's an uncomfortable moral ledger.
Yes, and there's another moral ledger, how the public and media treat suspects. Roger Arnold's life was altered by suspicion. The public reaction to Lewis shaped public thinking without a murder conviction. Investigations affect real lives and communities. We need careful reporting and sober policing, both of which were tested in this case.
We promised listeners we'd leave this episode somber and reflective, and we've traced how 7 deaths reshaped law, packaging, corporate crisis response, and public memory. But we also promised to keep the mystery alive, to respect that the simplest question, who did it, remains unanswered. Before we wrap, I want to read some quick facts for the record, so listeners have the timeline in mind.
Go ahead.
Date range: late September to early October 1982, primarily September 29 to October 1. Confirmed deaths: 7, Mary Kellerman, Adam, Stanley, and Theresa Janus, Mary Reiner, Mary McFarland, and Paula Prince. Poison: potassium cyanide, in some capsules up to 3 times lethal. Product: extra-strength Tylenol capsules across multiple lot numbers. Recall: roughly 31 million bottles recalled nationwide, with a retail value over $100 million at the time. Main suspect, historically, James William Lewis, convicted of extortion, not murder, died 2023. Key legal outcome: the 1983 Federal Product Tampering Statute. FDA action: tamper-resistant packaging rules issued November 5, 1982. Notable copycat conviction: Stella Nickel, Excedrin murders, 1986, 90-year sentence.
And I'll add, the case remains open. Modern labs have retested and continue to pursue DNA and trace evidence where possible. But as of now, no one has been charged with the Chicago Tylenol murders.
Listeners, it's easy, when you hear a list of facts, to drift into headlines and forget the people. I want to end with a moment of remembering. Mary Kellerman was 12 years old. She had a cold. Mary Reiner was a new mother. Paula Prince was a flight attendant. These were ordinary lives that intersected with a form of violence most of us had never imagined before that week. Their names are part of Chicago's memory now, and their families have spent decades waiting for answers.
It's a haunting case because it changed how Americans use medicine and how companies and regulators protect consumers, yet it left a void in accountability. As a forensic scientist, I'm grateful for the changes in technology and law that help prevent future tragedies. As a citizen, I'm unsettled that after all this time, 40 years plus, those families still don't have a named perpetrator in a court of law.
So, where does that leave us? With new documentaries and refreshed public interest, sometimes new leads emerge. We can hope that improved forensic testing, combined with persistent investigative work and public tips, will one day produce the clarity these families deserve. But until then, this case is still unanswered. Marcus, any final thoughts before we sign off?
Remain skeptical of simple answers. Cases like this have layers: criminal, corporate, regulatory, social. The Tylenol murders rewrote part of our legal and commercial landscape, but they also left us with a moral question about prevention and about how we treat victims and suspects. Let's not forget the human cost while we analyze the systems.
Thank you, Marcus. And thank you, listeners, for joining us on this episode of Still Unanswered. If you have tips or memories to share that might help investigators, please contact the Chicago Police Department Cold Case Unit or the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office. We'll be back next week with another unsolved story that reshaped policy and lives. Until then, be careful with what's on your shelves. Good night.
Good night.